Initially, this video was meant to be about my caffeine habits, but I actually thought the video out in my head and I didn't find it entertaining enough. So I thought, I probably wouldn't have watched this video myself. Now, I went away, had a little think, and here's a little twist to the original video plan. Now, this isn't your usual day in the life. I'll definitely walk you through a day in my life as a final year medical student. But in the meantime, I'm also going to be discussing how caffeine plays an important role. I've started to think more about my caffeine habits because I've noticed I rely on it quite a bit, especially with my final exams coming up. And in this video, I just want to sit down and speak to you guys about what caffeine is, how it helps us, and a little bit about the science behind it. And I guess I can share some of my personal experiences with it too. I'm also interested in hearing your experience, so make sure you leave a comment down below on how you use it, how much of it you drink, and whether or not you measure or even take it as seriously as I do. So my day usually starts at 7 o'clock, but earlier if I have extra work to get done. Now it roughly takes me about 30 minutes to get myself ready for the day, which is perfect because 30 to 45 minutes in the morning is when your cortisol usually peaks after you wake up. And that gives me a small boost to crack on for a short period of time. And it saves me from having any caffeine before sitting down to work. Now, depending on the day of the week, my routine can change. So during weekdays, I actually work on the vast content that needs covering for medicine. And during weekends, like today, I'd choose to work on research or planning or filming for the videos that I have upcoming. Now, I start my work at around 7:30 a.m. and work in, I'd say, 45-minute bursts. And after the first burst of work, I'd also take my first dose of caffeine. So I give myself 45 minutes and then a 15-minute break and a bit of caffeine. So let's talk a little bit about the science behind it. So adenosine is a molecule that has been very closely linked to sleep quality and even the feeling of sleepiness itself. In a normal human, adenosine will bind to the A1 receptors in your brain, which promotes muscle relaxation and sleepiness. It's essentially your brain's way of signaling to your body when it's time to go to sleep. Adenosine can also bind to A2A receptors, which release dopamine, causing you to feel good and uplift your mood. Generally, adenosine is released progressively throughout the day. Its release is mediated by both physical activity and long-term intensive brain use. So for example, if I was to spend a day studying, it would be similar to having a very intense workout at the gym. And at the end of the day, I'll be very groggy and tired and probably a little bit miserable and angry but maybe that's just me, I'm not sure. Now, my first dose of caffeine is usually Brainzyme. However, this changes depending on how I feel. So each capsule usually contains about 40 milligrams of caffeine, and caffeine essentially interferes with this system that I've just described by acting as a competitive inhibitor. Now, what this means is that it will bind to the A1 receptor site and prevent adenosine from binding by blocking the active site, and hence the name competitive inhibitor. Once I've taken a Brainzyme pill on an empty stomach, it is absorbed by the small intestine within probably half an hour and becomes readily available in my blood and brain to be utilized. Interestingly, remember those A2A receptors that we mentioned, which can help make you feel good? Well, caffeine also binds to them, which might also explain why coffee makes you feel all good and warm on the inside. However, this warm feeling might actually be your insides burning from a really hot steaming coffee that you've just drank. Not sure if that's scientific. Now, depending on the timetable for the week, sometimes I'm scheduled to be on the wards in the evenings and sometimes I can be in during the mornings all week. This is part of my degree and it's not paid for, and it's for our own learning. And I usually then tend to log in and check if I'm working a paid shift at the hospital via an app called Circular Wave. Now, this allows me to book shifts in advance for which I would get paid for if I have some free time that evening or if I have some free time on the weekend. Now, based on guidance from NHS England, we're allowed to work a maximum of 12 hours on bank shifts in a week. Now, let's say for the sake of this video that I'm scheduled to be on the ward during the evening. I'm currently on a medical block in my timetable after completing an 8-week surgical block. And during that surgical block, I actually spent time with plastic surgeons, orthopedics, general surgeons, vascular surgeons, colorectal surgeons, basically a lot of surgeons. And I also spent some time in ITU, which has now been repurposed as a COVID ward. Now that I'm on my medical ward and my medical rotation, my role actually involves clerking patients, taking a history, asking the nurses for a complete set of OBS, examining them and discussing a management plan for the patient with the consultant. Now, this is usually the job of the junior doctors, but the hospital have given us the pleasure of doing it and, the privilege of doing it, which is great because it helps us reinforce a lot of content that I might go through during the day or the day before. And it also gives me a lot of confidence on the job. I guess it's hard to describe until you're in fifth year or in your final year and then you realize what I mean. So going back to my morning, usually around 9 a.m. after the second 45-minute timer is complete, I then crack on with what I've got scheduled for the week. Now, 6 weeks ago, I created a plan for my exams. The plan detailed the specialties that I needed to cover over 12 weeks leading up to my exams. During the morning, I'd either choose to get my set of questions done for the day or cover the actual core conditions on my iPad whilst making additional notes. Again, I'd continue this for another 45 minutes while I have caffeine in my system. So, when reading up about the science, a few things troubled me and made me question my reliance on caffeine. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you probably have seen a video where I talk about sleep and how I struggled with sleep and trying to track the quality of it and then how I managed to improve it. Now, this again was brought to my attention when I read about the half-life of caffeine. So it depends on the person. However, the half-life of caffeine can actually range from around 3 to 10 hours, and it's all based on the concentration of CYP1A2 enzymes which your body contains. And this is actually genetically determined and can be very complex, so it's best that we don't dig down that rabbit hole. Now, for argument's sake, let's say I'm nearer to the high end of the spectrum and caffeine in my body has a half-life of around 8 to 9 hours. This means that if I consume caffeine at 3 p.m. in the afternoon as a midday boost, around 12 a.m. I would still have a significant blood concentration of caffeine, which is circulating through my system and stopping me from getting a good night's sleep. So to give you an example, yesterday I actually had a cup of tea at 2 p.m. and I tracked my sleep that night, and my deep sleep was relatively low, whereas my light sleep was close to the upper limit of 55%. If you want to find out more about sleep, I have a whole video on me trying to improve my sleep and explaining the makeup of it. Usually after 2 or 3 bursts of work, I'd then consider having some breakfast. Now, sometimes it can be a pack of crisps, which I understand isn't the healthiest, but like most things, it's how you feel and what you feel like eating most of the time, unless you're very disciplined. However, recently I've actually started having quite a bit of porridge. It keeps me full for a while and usually doesn't make me crash like other cereals often do. And yeah, sometimes it tastes nice. Now, after a bowl of porridge, I'll be back for usually my last burst of work before I genuinely tire out. And I reckon I probably could fit in another burst of work. However, I can tell when my mind isn't functioning at its best, and I usually tend to get distracted quite a bit at that point and close to the afternoon. So this is usually either a sign for another dose of caffeine or get on with some boring tasks that don't really need much brain power. So it's hard to pinpoint an exact time when I first began consuming caffeine, specifically for its energy boosting benefits. Now, most of us have had a Pepsi as a kid and probably will have been exposed to caffeine in relatively low doses throughout our lives. But I reckon around 16 years old during my A-levels was when I first started drinking coffee. And, A-levels were hard. It required you to actually concentrate for long periods of time, learn huge amounts of information. So that extra cup of coffee or tea would actually give me a boost, enough to stay awake and enough to motivate me to actually sit down and get my work done. But if I break it down to its core, it's pretty fascinating that there's a drug in society that's normalized, where no one will bat an eyelid when a teenager, 15, 16-year-old, is consuming it. And that might be due to the form that it's taken in, because most people will probably take caffeine in some sort of a hot drink, and that's socially acceptable. It's actually important to remember that caffeine at its core is a drug that exerts pharmacological properties. So now that my caffeine lecturing is over, I try and get through the afternoon doing chores or shopping, or like I said, any activities that don't really require caffeine or much brain power. Now, once I've completed that, I then try and crack on with a few more questions, which usually, again, you don't really need that much energy, but it's something fun, I guess. And I'd also start prepping for some teaching, which me and my flatmates do. Now, considering we're all going to be sitting our finals exam this year, we've decided to sort of take a topic that we've covered today or yesterday and teach it to the rest of us. And this helps us in two ways. So one is that it reinforces what we've learned, and secondly, we all teach each other what we've just brushed up on, and it helps each other as well. Thank you guys for watching. This has been one of the more fun and structured days in my life that I've actually recorded. I've thoroughly enjoyed creating this short video, and I hope you have too. Hopefully you've gained something from it, whether it's a study tip or facts about caffeine. But that is all, and bye for now.